Imagine a world where death arrives slowly, where it comes on horseback, where it comes with the swing of a blade, where it comes with time enough for you to see it coming. A world where the strongest walls ever built could stand against the fury of any army that threw itself against them. Where distance meant safety, where a city properly defended could hold out for months, even years, against the most determined siege. That was the world. And it was about to end. But before we talk about the fire, we need to talk about where it was born. Because gunpowder didn't emerge from nowhere. It came from a specific place, at a specific moment, from a culture obsessed with something very particular, the search for immortality. We're in China, the 9th century. And when we say China, we're not talking about a nation like the ones we know today. We're talking about one of the most complex, wealthy, and populous empires the world had ever seen. An empire where alchemy wasn't just a fringe practice, it was woven into the very fabric of how people understood the universe. The alchemists of Tang Dynasty China were searching for something that had consumed human imagination since the beginning of time, the elixir of eternal life. They believed that if they could find the right combination of substances, the right proportions, the right process, they could create something that would allow a man to live forever. It was an obsession that drove them into laboratories, into the depths of caves where rare minerals were found, into conversations with monks and philosophers who claimed to understand the hidden laws of nature. These men worked with materials that seemed almost magical in their properties. Sulfur that burned with an intensity unlike any wood or coal, charcoal that, when ground to the right fineness, became almost like powder, and saltpeter, a substance that appeared naturally in certain regions, that could be extracted from soil, that had properties no one fully understood but everyone recognized as powerful. They mixed these substances in different proportions, heated them in carefully controlled furnaces, watched what happened, recorded their observations, and tried again. It was meticulous work. Dangerous work, work that killed people. Accidents in alchemical laboratories were common, and when they involved these particular substances, they were catastrophic. A man's hands burned away, a room filled with smoke and flame. The acrid smell that lingered for days, but the alchemists kept working because they believed they were close, because they thought that one more combination, one more adjustment might be the one that unlocked the secret of eternity. And then, one day, in a moment that no one recorded, and no one will ever know exactly how it happened, they created something that would do the exact opposite of what they were searching for. They created the most efficient tool for death that human beings had ever invented. They created gunpowder. And when that first mixture ignited, when that first flash of light and sound erupted in a laboratory that wasn't prepared for it, the world's fate was sealed. The Song dynasty ruled China for 3 centuries. And those 3 centuries were a constant battle for survival. To the north, there were always enemies. Right? So the Khitans first, then the Jurchen, and finally, the name everyone knows, the Mongols under Genghis Khan and his descendants. The Song lived under the shadow of invasion, and that shadow shaped everything they did, everything they created, every choice they made about how to defend themselves. This was the crucible where gunpowder evolved from a laboratory curiosity into a weapon of war. The Song didn't have the luxury of theoretical interest. They needed advantage. They needed something that would give them an edge against enemies that were, in many ways, superior in the traditional arts of war. The Mongols were brilliant cavalry tacticians, the Jurchen were fierce warriors, the Song had to innovate or die. When the reports about Huo Yao, the fire medicine, reached the imperial palace, they didn't arrive as an alchemical curiosity. Or they arrived as a strategic question. And in the Song court, strategic questions had one destination. They became state secrets. The production of gunpowder was centralized. The ingredients, especially saltpeter, were controlled. Alchemists who worked with the mixture were monitored, sometimes imprisoned, always watched. The Song understood something that few empires in history have truly grasped, that controlling a technology meant controlling the future. But controlling knowledge is harder than controlling materials. An invention isn't like a physical object that you can lock in a vault. An invention lives in the minds of men. And minds move, they migrate, they tell stories in taverns, they teach sons and daughters, they write notes that get lost and found generations later. The Song tried to keep the secret. Right? They tried with every method available to a 9th century empire. But the secret was too diffuse. Too many men understood pieces of it, and when you put the pieces together, you have the whole. The first military uses of gunpowder were modest, almost embarrassed compared to what would come later. In the late Tang Dynasty in the 9th and 10th centuries, gunpowder appeared not as a weapon, but as a tool of intimidation, of fear, of psychology. The Chinese discovered that gunpowder could be packed into bamboo tubes and launched toward the enemy. The result wasn't necessarily lethal, not at first, but it was devastating psychologically. A sudden explosion, a flash of fire, dense, foul-smelling smoke on a battlefield where horses had never heard anything like it. That created chaos, horses that threw their riders. soldiers who dropped their weapons by reflex, formations that fell apart not because they were destroyed, but because they were terrified. This was new, completely new. In every war humanity had fought until that moment, fear was a consequence of physical violence. You saw the enemy advancing, and you were afraid of being killed. Gunpowder introduced something different: fear of the unknown, fear of a sound with no visible source, fear of fire coming from nowhere. And that fear, in certain contexts, was more effective than violence itself. The first gunpowder projectiles didn't explode like bombs. They were closer to what we call flares or smoke grenades today. Bamboo containers filled with gunpowder, sometimes mixed with additional substances, poisons, incendiary materials, substances with strong smells that irritated the eyes, launched with catapults or existing siege weapons. Gunpowder didn't replace existing weapons, it added a new dimension to them. By the 10th century, something had shifted. That the Song dynasty had moved beyond intimidation. They were now building weapons that could actually destroy. Fire lances appeared, bamboo tubes filled with gunpowder that, when ignited, expelled flames more than 3 meters long. They were short-range weapons, dangerous to the operator as much as to the target. But in street fighting or siege warfare, they became something no warrior had ever faced: a man who breathed fire. Fire arrows evolved too. Incendiary arrows had existed for thousands of years, but when gunpowder was incorporated into their design, they became something new. The first military rockets in human history were Chinese from the 10th century, a bamboo tube with gunpowder in the back and an arrow point in the front. When ignited, the tube propelled the arrow with speed and range that no bow could match. And when dozens of these rockets were launched simultaneously, as records suggest they were, the effect on enemy formations was, at minimum, terrifying. But the real leap came with what we might call the firearm proper, the prototype of what would eventually become the cannon. And it didn't happen all at once. It was a process of decades, of tests and failures, and accidental deaths and modifications. Bamboo was strong but limited. The pressure generated by gunpowder explosion inside a bamboo tube could crack the bamboo. And a cracked bamboo tube in a soldier's hands meant certain death for that soldier and everyone nearby. The solution was metal. And the Song had sophisticated metallurgy. They had blacksmiths who worked iron and bronze with the mastery of centuries of accumulated skill. The first metal tubes for propulsion appeared around the 11th and 12th centuries. They were small, heavy, imprecise. The projectile they expelled didn't have a standard shape. The distance they could reach was modest compared to what would come later, but the principle was there. The principle that said it's possible to use the force of gunpowder to propel a solid projectile against an enemy, and once that principle became clear, there was no stopping it. The battles of the Song period against the Yurchen and later against the Mongols are filled with references to gunpowder weapons. The Mongol besiegers surrounding Song cities faced bombardiers dropping ceramic bombs from the walls, rockets that covered the battlefield with flames, and a weapon that records called the Heavenly Thunder, probably an advanced version of a combined effect bomb that exploded with sound, flame, and fragments, a grenade in modern language. The Mongols, who were brilliant military strategists, did what they always did. They learned, they observed. They captured engineers and craftsmen, and they took the technology of gunpowder to the rest of the world they were conquering, to Persia, to Iraq, to North Africa, to eventually Europe. But before that, there was the Battle of Kayuku in 1232, one of the most documented siege battles in the history of primitive gunpowder. The Mongols surrounded the city. The Song defenders, knowing the city would probably fall, used their gunpowder weapons with the desperation of those who had nothing left to lose. Bombs descended from the walls continuously. The Mongols, who had seen much in the world, were impressed enough to document what they saw. Thunder coming from inside the walls, fire that couldn't be extinguished with water, weapons that killed at a distance without anyone having moved. The city fell. But the knowledge didn't fall with it. Because knowledge never falls with cities. It survives in the survivors, in the refugees, in the prisoners, in the engineers that the victor is smart enough not to kill. And there's a question that seems simple, but hides one of the most complex and disturbing stories in human history. How did a Chinese invention of the 9th century become the force that Europeans would use to conquer the world in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries? The answer isn't simple. It's not a straight line. It's a web of trade routes, of cultural exchange, of military conquest, of knowledge that refused to stay contained. The Mongols were pragmatically brilliant. They didn't destroy what they could use. Craftsmen, engineers, doctors, astronomers, all were spared, captured, relocated to wherever they were most useful to the empire. Chinese engineers who mastered gunpowder technology were taken to the Middle East. Technicians from there were taken to other regions. Gunpowder, which China had tried to keep as a state secret for centuries, became, in the hands of the Mongols, knowledge that crossed borders as easily as mounted troops. In the Islamic world, gunpowder found a civilization with a sophisticated tradition of alchemy and metallurgy. The Arabs adapted, improved, renamed. The madfa, an Arabic term for a propulsion tube, appears in manuscripts from the 13th century. The Persians developed their own formulations, and the Middle East became a new center of innovation with gunpowder, developing weapons and techniques that circulated on trade routes connecting Baghdad to Venice, Alexandria to Cairo, the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. Europe arrived at gunpowder late. The first clear European mention appears in the work of Roger Bacon, an English Franciscan monk, around 1267. Bacon describes a substance that, when combined in a certain way, produces thunder and a flash that can frighten any army. He knew the ingredient. He knew, at least partially, the process, and he understood clearly the potential it represented. But Europe of the 13th century was still far from knowing what to do with it. The European delay in gunpowder technology compared to China was more than 3 centuries. 3 centuries during which China had developed rockets, bombs, primitive firearms. Europe was starting from zero, or almost. But Europe had something that accelerated the process brutally: the urgent need for wars that were already happening. The Reconquista in the Iberian Peninsula, the Crusades in the East, the 100 Years' War between France and England, which these were contexts of permanent conflict that generated an insatiable demand for military advantage. The European cannon emerged as a significant weapon in the 14th century, heavy, imprecise, slow to reload, dangerous to those operating it, but transformative. The stone wall, which had defined defensive warfare for millennia, suddenly had an enemy its equal, an iron or stone projectile propelled by gunpowder, impacting against stone with a force that no battering ram, no catapult, no siege machine before it had ever matched. In 1453, Constantine XI, the last Roman emperor of the East, looked from the walls of Constantinople at the cannons of the Ottoman siege. Those cannons had been built by European engineers. They were firing at the last remnant of Rome. And when those walls fell, walls that had stood for 1,000 years, it wasn't to cavalry or infantry. It was to fire and iron and the explosive force of a substance that had been born in a Chinese alchemist's laboratory searching for immortality. The Europeans took gunpowder and put cannons on ships. And with cannons on ships, they sailed to the rest of the world. Vasco da Gama, Columbus, Cortez, Pizarro. What they carried wasn't just Christian faith and greed for gold. They carried cannons, they carried muskets, they carried the ability to kill at a distance with an efficiency that no Aztec warrior, no Inca emperor, no African king had ever encountered before. The empires that were destroyed in this process, the Aztec, the Inca, the kingdoms of the African coast, the civilizations of Southeast Asia, weren't inferior in intelligence, in culture, in social organization. They were inferior in one aspect. They didn't have gunpowder, or they had less developed versions of it. And that technological difference was enough for European minorities to conquer and enslave entire civilizations. Gunpowder didn't just change how wars were fought, it changed who could win wars. And by changing that, it changed the map of the world. It created empires. It destroyed civilizations. It redistributed wealth on a global scale, and it redistributed it brutally, violently, irreversibly. The human cost was staggering. Millions died. Cultures were erased. Entire ways of life were obliterated. And all of it was enabled by a substance that had been created by men searching for the secret to eternal life. There's an irony that persists through all these centuries, which the Taoist alchemists, who mixed saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal, were searching for the elixir that would defeat death. They wanted immortality. They wanted man not to die. And what they created was exactly the opposite: the tool that allowed men to kill each other in quantities and with an efficiency without precedent in history. Gunpowder didn't kill just with its projectiles. It killed with the system it created around itself, because a society that has cannons needs iron to build them, needs saltpeter to feed them, needs trade routes to supply these two ingredients, needs labor to operate the factories that produce them. And all of this creates a machinery of death that extends far beyond the battlefield. The workers who made gunpowder were often children. In all pre-modern eras, children worked. The sons of gunpowder artisans learned the trade from childhood, first doing the simplest work, carrying materials, cleaning tools, grinding components individually, far from any mixture. Then gradually, they were introduced to more complex processes. By 15, a boy raised in this tradition knew more about gunpowder than any general who had ever used it in battle. This accumulated knowledge, transmitted through generations of anonymous workers, was what made possible the qualitative leap that gunpowder made over the centuries of the 10th and 11th centuries. It wasn't a brilliant scientist working in isolation. It was the silent accumulation of thousands of hours of experience, of survived accidents and fatal accidents, of tiny adjustments in proportion that improved performance by imperceptible fractions, but that, added over time, transformed a mixture that frightened into a mixture that devastated. The world that gunpowder created is the world we still live in. The balance of power between nations, the structure of empires, the wealth of some regions, and the poverty of others, all of it traces back in some way to that moment when a Chinese alchemist mixed three substances together and created something he didn't fully understand. The technology has evolved. The cannons of the 14th century are nothing like the weapons of today. But the principle remains the same. The ability to project force at a distance, to kill without being close enough to see the face of the person you're killing, to destroy from afar. This principle changed something fundamental in human nature. It changed the relationship between courage and survival. In hand-to-hand combat, strength, skill, and bravery mattered. A man could look his enemy in the eye and know that his actions determined the outcome. Gunpowder removed that. A child could fire a musket. An old man could operate a cannon. Bravery became almost irrelevant. What mattered was who had the technology and who didn't. And that's what makes Gunpowder's story so haunting. It's not just a story about a weapon. It's a story about how innovation can reshape the world in ways that no one intended. The alchemists weren't trying to create an instrument of conquest. They were trying to create immortality. But what they created instead was a tool that would kill millions, that would destroy civilizations, that would reshape the entire global order. And once it was created, there was no putting it back. The knowledge spread, right? The technology evolved, and the world was never the same. Today, we live in the shadow of that discovery. Every conflict, every war, every act of violence that involves firearms traces back to that moment in a Chinese laboratory. The weapons are more sophisticated now. The reach is longer. The destructive power is greater. But the fundamental principle, using chemical energy to propel a projectile with lethal force, that principle is still the same. It's still the invention of those alchemists searching for immortality. And perhaps that's the deepest irony of all. They were searching for something that would allow humanity to transcend death. What they found instead was the most efficient way to inflict it. They were searching for life eternal. What they created was death industrial. And in doing so, they changed the course of human history in ways that continue to echo 500 years later. The world they created, a world where power flows from the ability to kill at a distance, where empires are built on military technology, where the strong dominate the weak through superior firepower, that world is still ours. And it all began with three substances mixed in a laboratory by men who had no idea what they were creating.